All right, let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Stephen. My name is Claudio. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the Student Fairfax. We're very humble and grateful that Stephen Taylor accepted our invitation and show. Stephen, this is part two. Welcome again, man. How you doing?
Hello, Claudio. Stephen W Tayler here, as ever.
That's right. How are you, man? You doing all right? How's the
Doing
weather over there?
fine. Well, funnily enough, the weather today, looking out the window, it's pouring rain. So it's nice to be inside, even though I know the WOMAD festival is on at the moment, which I haven't been to this year, but I can imagine that's not very pleasant being outside.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, you are a little introduction. You're an English mixing and recording engineer, music producer, musician, composer, who have contributed toward hundreds of albums, including Kate Bush, of course, Suzanne Vega, Peter Gabriel, Duncan Sheik, Howard John, Stevie Nicks, Rupert Hine, Tina Turner, The Fix, Howard Jones, blah, blah, blah. Man,
Yeah.
you're a very famous guy, so I'm very grateful that you're spending
Thank
an
you.
hour of your time with me, man.
I mean, it's quite a diverse set of artists I've worked with over the years, which is why most of my career I haven't really been sort of pigeonholed into one category.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain areas I do specialize in, but it's been interesting and such a really fascinating bunch of people.
Yeah, and they keep it fresh.
Yes, it's. I mean, there are some artists that I'm delighted to be invited back to work on more projects, but it does keep it fresh when you're always changing to work with different genres and different styles of songwriting or music writing. And so I've been very blessed in that respect to be involved in all kinds of different capacities as well, from basic recording through mixing, through co-production and production, and in more recent years, composition and some involvement with live events. Not much, but that has also been fascinating.
All right, good for you, man. Let's go back to the period of you starting your career between 76 and 80. Three bring name that I want to bring into attention: Gong, Bill Bruford, of course. Any recollection, any memories from that period in your life?
Well, working with Gong was not incidental, but it turned out to be one of the first. It was in fact the first during the first month of me as a mixing engineer, and I was working with a producer called Dennis Mackay, who had been a staff engineer at Trident. And he went on to become a producer, and he got involved in all kinds of acts like Mahavishnu and Shakti and Gong and Tommy Bolin. Tommy Bolin was the first one, but Gong was very shortly after that. And I only came in at the mixing stage. So during that, I seem to remember only meeting Pierre Merlin during the mix sessions, because literally it was just Dennis coming in with the tapes and Pierre. And I'm not sure I even met Alan Holdsworth at that stage, because he had played on the album. Brilliant.
Correct, yeah.
But that was a real experience for me, because, yes, I'm working alongside Dennis Mackay, who was one of the finest engineers, well, still is, but at that period, he was quite sort of creative and innovative. And so I picked up a lot from working with him, and he had picked up a lot working alongside Ken Scott before that. So there was this sort of lineage of interesting production techniques, etc. So I don't remember much about the Gong album, other than it really suited my sort of musical tastes at that time. So I felt very lucky to work on that. Soon after that, I started to get more involved with the actual recording and mixing of projects. One of the first where I did the whole thing from start to finish would have been with Brand X. But very shortly after that, having got to know Brand X's keyboard player, Robin Lumley, Robin was asked to produce Bill Bruford's solo album, Feels Good to Me. And Robin asked me to come alongside him and record and mix it. So here was my introduction to Bill Bruford. Now, I'd been a big Yes fan during the Yes album period and Fragile, so I was a big fan of Bruford. So that was really a great opportunity, and to meet the other great musicians, but particularly Alan Holdsworth, who now this was a second hookup, but this time I get to record him and meet him. So that was a fascinating project. I mean, back in those days, recording an album such as that was done relatively quickly, I have to say. You know, we'd had 2 or 3 weeks of recording and then about 10 days of mixing at the most, you know, so bands would come in fairly well prepared. What I do remember about Bruford was that so much of the music was not only sort of written and rehearsed, but it had been handwritten. Bill would write all those complex, particularly like the marimba or xylophone parts, or vibraphone or marimba, as well as all the keyboard parts for Dave Stewart. So it was very well prepared, but it allowed for myself and Robin Lumley to start thinking of sort of interesting approaches to the recording techniques. And so we started to develop a lot of things that then sort of led us through the next few years.
Yeah, that's great. And Stephen, you mentioned something interesting. Is it for someone like myself that, you know, don't do that for a living? It's a big difference between, obviously, I assume that the pay is better if you do the recording and the mixing. But at the beginning, you were doing just the mixing. Is it, so the recording is already done for any band, right? XYZ
Yes.
band. The recording is already done. Okay, now Stephen, sit here. I want you to mix the stuff. It's a lot harder. I mean, the product is kind of already done, right? 90% done. Is it, let's say the recording is great. I suppose that the mixing, easy for me to say, wouldn't be that difficult. But if the recording is not that great, how can you kind of improve it, fix it, add your Stephen Tayler touch if the stuff is kind of 90% cooked, so to speak, right?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I mean, things have really changed. In those early days when I started, really a lot of choices and techniques had to be committed at the time of recording. It wasn't like now where you have multiple chances to redo something and do hundreds of alternative takes and things. You had to not only get the sound quality as you hoped to capture it, which would give you maximum amount of control for the mixing process. But it's about committing the performance. And that was really, you know, capturing the sound was really important, but it's managing in a very sort of limited time period to get the performance onto tape, because back then, once it was on tape, there was very little you could do in the mixing other than change the level, change the compression or the equalization, or add the reverberation or the delays, but you weren't able to actually go in and sort of do editing the way we can now to fix things or make them louder or quieter. So you really hoped that the quality of the recording was good, but also the quality of the performance. And I was quite lucky because I was getting projects in that had been recorded by people who really knew what they were doing. But then as I started to do it myself, you know, I began to learn the importance of, yes, getting you don't want to commit a sound that you can't undo, like it by adding too much distortion or too much effect. But at the same time, if you're happy with what you're hearing, then you should capture it. What's happened in more recent years is being able to record something and say, well, we can decide how to deal with that later. And that's become known as a bit like a thing called fix it in the mix, which it makes it interesting these days when I am sent a new project to mix. Quite often there's a lot of choice and a lot of tracks, and the drums might have been recorded with every microphone on a separate channel. Back then, you didn't have enough tracks to do that, so you had to be very good, like recording Bill Bruford or Phil Collins back then. We were recording on 24 tracks, so you had to make choices about how many of those 24 tracks you could assign for the drums. Before that, it was 16 tracks. So generally, there would be 4 tracks of drums: the bass drum, the snare drum, and then a stereo pair of tracks with all the other tom-toms, cymbals, hi-hats, and everything mixed together. So you had to be very committed about how you assembled that. But that did mean that if it was done right, it made the mixing a lot simpler. These days, you've got to kind of go through the whole process of reassembling from scratch. And particularly now, I'm remixing a lot of projects that were recorded during those early days. It's a reminder of how good some of that, that real sort of making decisions there and then. It was important, and from time to time, it really worked. And from time to time, it was a real problem and difficult to fix.
And you say, I'm going back to, working the old stuff. Are all those master tapes stored somewhere safely and over the years for different bands that you can take you go back to the tapes, or improve generation after that? So,
well, it's an interesting question because I have been mixing a lot of albums that are, up to and even more than 50 years old. Sometimes tapes are lost forever. Sometimes they have deteriorated to a very poor state, and they can mostly be restored and then what we call digitized. So they're copied from the technique they have to do with a lot of old tapes is they have to bake them because they've become like they've started to disassemble and become the oxide has become sticky and it falls off the backing. So what they have to do is they have to bake it so that it hardens, and then they've got one chance, one run through to play it back and record it digitally. And that is there's huge business these days of people doing that, because so many back catalogs are, just stored away in warehouses, or, as I say, in some cases lost, and you can't go back and remix. But a lot of the older tapes I've received to remix from, some have been transferred and they're absolutely perfect, and occasionally you can hear there are issues, and then you have to try. At least these days we have a lot more good restoration possibilities with software and various techniques, but it as I say, it's interesting seeing how good the quality of the original recording was, how good the performance was and the capture of it, and then how well it can be restored after all this time.
Very, very good. The year after, in 78 and 79, you worked with Peter Gabriel in his second album, Scratch. I think you did the mix there for label Charisma, and then you did another track a year after for the track called I Don't Remember. Feel free to elaborate on memory you have with Peter and Rod Fripp in the same room and arguing and trying to make it better. One can say, do it this way. The other guy, no, whatever you can tell without being sued by the.
Well, it was a very interesting thing, really, because they had recorded in various places outside the country, and they came into Trident Studios to mix it. And I wasn't the engineer that was brought into the project. Was one of the other staff engineers. And I think what had happened, the mixing wasn't going very well because there was a certain sort of friction between Peter and Robert Fripp. On an artistic level, they agreed in a lot of ways, and it was a very interesting concept, the way it was produced. But what they had this fairly inexperienced engineer who was kind of caught in the middle between them, and he wasn't coping with it well. I mean, he was inexperienced, but also from a personality point of view, I think he wasn't managing to kind of get things done. I was brought in as one of the other staff engineers, and really it was almost like to become a sort of diplomat in the middle of this situation. So I had to work alongside this other engineer, but sort of take over from him and try and resolve the sort of differences that Peter and Robert were having. It's hard to remember because, as usual, I probably just, set my head down.
Concentrate on the job, right?
Yeah, and just got on with it. And as always, trying to sort of make sure everybody was getting what they received. So it was mostly that Robert really wanted to keep it fairly minimal in terms of effects or treatments. It was to keep it fairly dry and unaffected, apart from Peter's voice, which had a very deliberate effect on it using a device called an Eventide harmonizer, which can change the pitch slightly. And it was to kind of give his voice a sort of double layer of sound by having it slightly out of tune with itself. And so that was the one sort of real effect, along with, and I wasn't part of the recording, but along with like Robert's tape loop type effects, his layering and all the rest. So, but it was really interesting. I didn't mix every track. I did about 80% of the mixes on that. But I ended up with two of my all-time favorite tracks that I've worked on, one being White Shadow, which I think is the most amazing track, and also I can't remember the title of the other, but one of the more sort of acoustic based songs. Beautiful. So it was a bit of a challenge, but that was my introduction to Peter. And because I was becoming more involved with Hit and Run, which was the company that looked after Genesis, and consequently they set up another division for Peter after he left Genesis. So Peter had gone on the road to do promotion for the Scratch album. But while they were passing through London, he wanted to record potentially what they thought might be a next single. But anyway, it was a track. The band were in town for a couple of days, and they came into Trident to record it. And I was brought in to engineer this, and consequently was given a sort of co-production credit on it, because it was kind of Peter really producing it himself, but with the sort of technical side handled by me. So I recorded that, and then they went off on tour in America shortly after that, and the track wasn't finished, but it just so happened I was visiting America for the very first time in my life around the same time. And so I managed to hook up with them in New York to record Robert Fripp doing a guitar overdub solo for I Don't Remember, the track it was. And so that was done. And then a few days later, they were in Chicago. And I happened to be in Chicago at the same time as well. So they did a show, but on a day off, they came into a local studio there to record Peter's vocal and for me to mix the track. And so that was kind of wild, because this is some of the first work I was doing outside of Trident, in a sense. So I mixed this track in a completely unknown studio, and that led to another part of my life, because they wound up wanting to hire me, and I actually moved to America to work for Paragon. But that's another chapter, because that led to a lot of trouble. But anyway, but that track worked out really well, but it wound up being the B-side for Games Without Frontiers. So, it's a great track, but it was kind of a transition period for Peter's production. It was sort of part way between how he'd been with Fripp and partly on the way to the slightly more eccentric sound that he ended up developing with Steve Lillywhite after on the next album. So that was my introduction to Peter, really, and it was short-lived. But I did end up being managed by Hit and Run Management. So there's been a sort of real connection with the whole sort of Genesis, Brand X, Peter Gabriel thing throughout my whole life as a result of that sort of Trident period where I was involved with Hit and Run as well. So, yeah.
Got it. Perfect. Oh, now we're talking about Genesis. In 76, obviously, you worked for with the production of the Genesis, A Trick of the Tail. At the time, of course, Peter Gabriel had left. They're looking for a singer. They were trying different singer. Phil Collins, who got a great voice at the time, he tried to raise his hand, me, pick me. But then they were trying different things. And feel free to then again elaborate what you remember. That was Trident. They were bringing different people, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to remember anything about that, because it's such a long time ago. I was an assistant engineer and not the exclusive engineer for that album. They used to rotate us, so and that was quite a long production from memory. So I was only involved in a handful of the recording sessions, and I seem to remember being there for one of the sessions where they invited singers in to come and do a trial vocal on, I'm trying to remember which song now. No, I can't remember, but I don't remember anybody specific. There were a lot of unknown singers. There was one relatively well-known session singer, again, whose name I can't remember, but he had sung a lot of the backing vocals on Status Quo's records, and he became very famous as a session backing singer. And he was actually quite good, but I think there was still this thing where everybody realized that Phil Collins, having already sung solo tracks and backing vocals with Peter, that he already had the sort of best fitting sounding voice to go with what they were doing, and the real understanding. So I can sort of understand why they went that direction in the end, rather than bringing in someone new. But but it certainly was, an interesting time. That really was my only involvement with Genesis. But there is one small anecdote I have that I don't remember much about, other than the fact that I remember I was asked by Mike Rutherford and Tony if I could help them record a church organ for a film soundtrack they were writing. And so I remember being hired to go outside with a portable tape recorder and some microphones to a church somewhere in North London at the crack of dawn with Tony and Mike to record Tony playing an organ solo for this film soundtrack. Now, this film is called The Shout. It's not very well known, but it's quite a weird, eccentric film. And the other weird piece of trivia about that was that those two wrote the music soundtrack, but there was also some electronic sound recorded and featured in the film, because it was actually about a weird avant-garde electronic composer. But the electronic side of it, and also there's a moment where the main character does this enormous shout. I mean, it's a weird film. You have to go and look for
Check it out. Yeah.
But there is a big shout in the middle of the film. It's a real psychological thriller. But all this electronics and effects and stuff was composed by Rupert Hine, who I hadn't even met at that stage. But so there's this weird connection through this odd film through Genesis and Rupert. And of course, I think I met Rupert shortly after that at Trident. But so that really was my only involvement with Genesis around that time.
Yeah. Wow, man. Can't believe all the people that I was looking through the list again of all the people who worked.
Obviously, I did a bit more work with Phil Collins.
Yeah, that's what we're not talking now, right? So,
all right.
In 81 to 89, a couple albums with Phil Collins. You did a track, I think, "Don't Let Her Steal Your Heart Away." I think you did the mix, and then a VHS live at Perkins Place in 82, both in 82. What?
Well, that
was like to.
The thing is, I'd known Phil previously. Yeah. I first met him on a film soundtrack that David Henschel was working on. That's the first time I met him. I worked with Brand X with Phil. Phil came in and did guest drumming on a Rod Argent album that was produced by Robin Lumley. So I got to know him quite well through all those connections. But he was in the early 80s. He was currently having a success with a single, but he had recorded this and filmed this live show in I think in San Francisco, is it Perkins Palace? They'd recorded the sound for the King Biscuit Flower Hour, which used to be a broadcast thing that happened back in the 80s. So they wanted me to mix the live show, which I did. And it wound up then being synchronized to the footage they had of that and released on VHS. So that was great. I got to, and Phil came into the studio to do this while he was in the English top 20 with, I guess, Can't Hurry Love, I think was his hit at that moment.
Yeah, wow.
In the studio, and it was great to be mixing, some of his big songs, so that was fun. But when we finished mixing that live, his next single was you just mentioned it. I did a 12-inch mix for I've forgotten the title. What was it?
The track was "Don't Let Her Steal Your Heart Away."
Oh, that's right. Yes.
So the VHS was live at Perkins Palace.
Yes. Yeah. So that was like 2 or 3 intense days. In fact, might have been just only like 2 days in the studio doing all that work. And that was the last time I saw Phil. And I know he was going through a lot of publicity at that time because he was having hits, but he was also having personal problems and things like that. But
Yeah,
I
correct.
remember
Yeah,
it being a lovely time to hang out with him and catch up. But I haven't seen him since 40 years.
yeah, yeah. I think he's in kind of not in very good shape, according to Mike Rutherford. I saw an interview with Mike that they were asking how's the health of Phil, and he's not that great. And
Right.
it's too bad because, like I told you before, when we began talking, for me, Genesis with Peter Gabriel's called Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin are, according to Claudio, the best band in the history of music in the last 50 years. But that's my take on this stuff, So it's going to eventually, all of us will die and pass away, and it's going to be a sad. He's a very good person, I don't care about his personal problem or divorce or I always remember the good things about people and the music in my case,
Exactly. So. I mean, I'm working with a lot of material these days of people who have passed on or the rest. And for me, it's preserving the great work and the memory,
of course,
and keeping them alive in that sense is become very important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we talked before, it's kind of Mr. Fripp, Robert Fripp, he's kind of complicated person anyway to say that, but he's a great musician. Nobody will deny that, right? So
exactly,
it kind of sometimes go with territory, Great musicians are sometimes difficult to get along with, or so forth, right? So, but that's
well, sometimes the friction between people, this is something I think we might have talked about before, but when you get the friction between people like Peter and Robert Fripp, or amongst the members of the band UK, or even in Bruford things, there would be times when there would be friction between the people, and so many times that's kind of what creates a lot of the absolute moments in the music. So yes, a lot of the time music is all about joy and people coming together and all the rest, but sometimes when there is friction in there, it produces an amazing result. It's just that you don't want to really remember too much about that or even talk about that too much, because that's not what you want. You want people to sort of get their own feeling of what music's all about. So
and sometimes something very simple, any band, right? You're sitting in you're sitting here instead of the mixing recording booth, and then two guys to your left, one to the left and with the right. No, I want my drums to be better, goddamn it. No, I want my guitar in track number 2 to sound louder than your drum, because whatever. And you were two people talking, screaming at you in the back, and you say, man.
That's why you have to become a diplomat. That's what it's
you need to be like a psychologist to a diplomat.
Yeah.
It's a difficult job, I suppose, but that brings creativity, right? Everybody agree on a track and everything, and then only one person is doing the job, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So you need input for all the band members. Another great album, 84. Of course, Tina Turner, Private Dancer, Break Every Rule, record and mixing for Capitol Records, 1984. What can you remember?
Well, that was a very interesting project. Tina just started to have some recognition and success with, I guess, one of the singles she did with Heaven 17, and suddenly her manager thought, we've got to get an album made, and it was an extraordinary thing. He pulled together different teams of people and had all these different teams working on a couple of songs each during the same 2 weeks. So because Roger Davis had, he had connections with all kinds of different people. He asked Rupert Hine to produce one song and to write and produce one song for her. And there were various other teams. There was Terry Britton and Mark Knopfler and all these people off in different places. But this meant that everybody was kind of preparing the tracks without Tina there. I mean, I think the songs had sort of been either demoed or approved or whatever, but you had these teams working on their couple of songs each at the same time. And so from what I remember, I hadn't met Tina at this point. I think Rupert might have had a production meeting with her and discussed the material. So he'd met her up in London, but we're out in Buckinghamshire at the studio in the countryside, and Rupert would come down and basically prepare the tracks using keyboards, drum machines, and he also got the guitarist from the Fix, Jamie West Oram, to come in and play guitar parts and even get involved a bit in the sort of writing and arrangement. So we have the basic track recorded and mixed, and I think it's likely that Rupert might have put a little guide vocal on just so that he had a reference to the melody and everything while he was putting this together. Okay, so and I hadn't met Tina at this point, so then it was planned for her to come down and do her vocal. Now, this started to feel like probably quite a lot of pressure because, it's Tina for starters, massive star, haven't met yet. And we know she's a great performer. And, I better be ready, And from what I learned, Rupert gave Tina a lift from London out to Farmyard Studios. It's about 45-minute drive. And from what I understand, he had a cassette of the track in the car. And so she was rehearsing it, sitting in the passenger seat of his car all the way. Apparently they had real looks. They had real looks when they stopped at traffic lights, and people could see, that's Tina Turner in there singing.
Wow.
But anyway, so she turned up at the studio. We were introduced, and it was almost like she was raring to go. And I'd spent the couple of hours leading up to this making sure I had a really good headphone mix, something that's very sort of hopefully creative and inspiring so that she would react to it. But also I had to sort of guess, what microphone am I going to use? When I work with some singers, you lay out a collection of microphones, 4 or 5 microphones, to see which one works best with their voice. Tina, you better be ready to record right from the first moment. So I chose a microphone, a Neumann microphone. And then I thought, right, okay, I've got to be ready that I can get the levels and the sound and everything right really quickly, because it's going to be a lot of pressure. So I had, a chain of audio processing in line ready that I could adjust quickly and make choices. So I was terrified. Because I knew it literally was. We don't have a run through to get sound checks or anything like that. It's like you better press record, like from the first moment. So I'd met Tina and she was lovely and all the rest, but I was, as I say, a bit nervous. Anyway, so Rupert came in. She went out in the studio and he said, okay, you're going to hear the track. We'll give it a run through, he said to her. So, okay, so I pressed play and record, and I was there standing over the knobs, ready to control things. And she started singing, and what I had expected was that she would probably go from a whisper to a shout in, a moment. So how am I going to be ready for the kind of level and all of that? Anyway, without going into any boring details, I had various setups and things, and I was set on my settings within 10 seconds. So it was like in the first couple of lines of the song, and then after that, I'm leaving it sounding good. And so she wound up singing that song, and I think we probably used that first take, maybe went back and did the first line or two again. And, you know, what a relief. But she is known for just being a great performer, straight out of the box, if you like. And so she was amazing. I think she stayed for lunch. I don't know if we did. I think she came in another day to do the other song. But she didn't stick around because she was moving between the studios doing all these tracks at the same time. And so in a couple of weeks, these tracks were recorded and mixed. The album was put together, released, and became one of the biggest selling albums of all time. So there was quite something.
Wow.
And what a lovely person to work with. And of course, we went on a couple of years after that to do the following album again with a couple more songs, along with Rupert and Jamie West Oram on the guitar and everything. So that was more comfortable. We kind of knew a bit more what it was all about for the follow-up album. But yeah, a very special moment. But you know, once again, I didn't really have time to sort of really get to know Tina or form any kind of close relationship, because really it was just she was in and out doing the vocals, and as usual I had my head down concentrating. So Rupert would be doing most of the communication as a producer, and I'd be just making sure everything worked. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a stupid question. And but back in the day, was it important for like you to, you know, take a picture with the band, with her, with Phil, with Rodri, or buy a couple of vinyl and people sign for you? Was kind of popular for you, or for social media didn't exist back then? The internet, the no cell phones, so you need to old school cameras, or it wasn't like appropriate.
I mean, yes. I mean, I go back and look at I've got so few photographs that I took in the studio. You know, I have a collection of pictures I took during the Trident years of various sessions, a couple of dozen, you know, and so they weren't often group shots or selfies or anything like that. It was more like you'd take an opportunity to grab a picture without, you know, drawing too much attention. Of course, when it's on film, it wasn't like you go click, 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 because the film would be finished in 10 seconds. So you had to sort of choose your moment. So very few during the 70s. I had a few more during the 80s, during the farmyard period. And, you know, over the years, you know, you'd start collecting a few pictures, but you just didn't really think about it that much. And you should have done, because, you know, there's so much interesting stuff in the archives. Of course, now there's such a volume of material available that it's harder to have those sort of exclusive special moments. But yeah, signed records and things. No, we just didn't really think much about that back then.
Yeah. Well, you should write a book. I don't know if you have written a book, or you're planning on writing a book, or maybe one day you will look at all these interviews and say, hey, remember that I told Claudio about, you know, Private Dancer or this or that.
Well, it does sort of jog your memory sometimes talking about these things.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that's the thing about Private Dancer that's always been a bit on my mind is that of all the records I've ever worked on, they forgot to put my credit on the tracks that we did. Every other song had all the credits of the producers, the engineers, the musicians, the studios. All the personnel were listed for each track, but for some reason my name got left off. And I always thought, what are the chances on the biggest album, probably the biggest selling album that I've worked on, I never had a name credit on it, and everybody blamed each other for missing that. But it never got rectified. I mean, fortunately, on the following album it was done. But those are things you have to live with.
Yeah. Wow, man. No, I'm very serious about writing a book, Stephen. I mean,
people keep saying that to me. I should.
Let me get a list of. I got a list of a PDF of like 10 pages about stuff you work with. Man, UK, Brand X, Rupert Hine, The Fix, Howard Jones, Tina Turner, Morrigan, Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins, and on and on and on, man. People in the UK are very humble and quiet, and they don't like to blow their own horns like they say here in the United States. But you should, because you were there. You did the work. It's not that the
80s
right?
were an interesting time during the Farmyard years, because that's when we got involved with Howard Jones, Tina Turner. The Fix was a big part of that, obviously only really for the American market. Saga was an interesting one to work with as well. The Canadian band Saga that we worked with in the early 80s. But then, there are all kinds of other interesting things that led from there. I started working with some really interesting female artists around the time of the mid-80s, where I worked with an English singer called Judy Zook, who had a couple of big hits. I worked with Tapao, so Carol Decker. And then shortly after that, I went over on my first sort of real working trip to America and outside of Farmyard, was to work with Rupert Hine with Stevie Nicks. And so it was a very interesting time, because that started to be a transition between having always worked in a one place, like 70s Trident Studios. Very rarely did I work anywhere else. During the 80s, from 80 to 88, almost every project I did was at Farmyard Studios, which was co-owned by Rupert Hine and Trevor Morace, the drummer. And it was actually mostly Trevor Morace's business. But then Rupert had always wanted, I think, to look at possibly living in America or working in America. And so he went over to work with Stevie Nicks and invited me to go out there. And suddenly, I'm working outside the comfort zone. And it was a time when the kind of equipment that was being developed allowed people to set up studios in either sort of their homes, or they'd rent a house, and suddenly we were sort of putting in temporary studios, just bringing in a desk, a pair of speakers, some microphones, headphones, keyboards, and just sort of setting it up in a random space. And so that was a really big start, working on the Stevie Nicks album, because she'd rented this, I was going to say, chateau. It was called a chateau, but it was like a mansion house up in Beverly Hills. And the dining room in that house got converted into a temporary studio with a grand piano, a fairly simple recording console, and a 24-track tape machine, a cassette machine, and a couple of bits of outboard equipment and a few microphones. And so it wasn't just me starting to work outside in different studios. It's working in different environments and people's homes or hotel rooms and whatever. So it was a big change. And it's not only a big change in production and everything, but to me, just going and working in America like that, and getting used to the whole sort of American lifestyle and the American music business, and working with somebody as sort of prominent at that time as Stevie Nicks. So that was a real eye-opener for me, and a very interesting time. Got to work with lots of different great musicians, and Stevie was such an interesting person, surrounded by a real sort of small clique of people that sort of not protected her from the outside world, but just kept things very under control. So it was a big sort of lifestyle change for me, going and living in a hotel, or a rented house, in fact, in Hollywood. So and so I'm taking all that into account, all that change, and at the same time working on a really interesting album with Rupert, Hine and Stevie Nicks. We did in the end come back to the UK to do the final mixing and the finishing of it. But that was what was quite nice about that production, in a sense, being in a private place rather than a rented studio. It allowed a lot of time for Rupert, who was helping. Stevie was writing the material, but sort of experimenting, and he was helping with the production and arrangement. And so they take their time trying things out. So in a sense, it was a new way of doing things, rather than in the past, it was bands coming in prepared and recording their material. So that was a very interesting change for me.
Yeah. Wow, man. Stevie Nicks. Wow. What unbelievable. You have worked with Howard Jones in many, many albums, right? The one in '84, the Humans Live, and then Dream into Action, the second one in '86. What memory you have for Howard? So he's a very nice person. I saw him. I went to a show a couple of days ago, and Howard Jones, Boy George with Culture Club. There were three bands, and he still sounds great, and he's a funny guy, nice person.
Howard's amazing, because I mean he had a very prominent sort of profile during the 80s, with the sort of whole electric sort of pop period, and he had sort of quite a number of hit singles. A lot of people sort of just think that's just him, but the fact is that he moved out of the limelight a bit after the first few albums, and he stopped working with the major label and developed his own label, his own studio, and he's carried on. He's one of the most prolific musicians I know. He's carried on, not just writing more sort of albums in that similar vein, but he also does piano solo albums. He does piano solo tours. He's a great pianist. People think of him as just being the electronic keyboard player, but he's actually a great piano player. So he does solo piano tours. He does solo acoustic tours with bass and guitar, with Robin Bolton, Nick Beggs, and he's always doing new material and new experimental stuff. But he's also he's very gracious in going back and re-performing all his big hits for people who really enjoy it. So he isn't just going out and doing the old stuff all the time like some acts do, but he does respect the people who just want that. But he's the loveliest guy. Again, it was an introduction that came to Rupert, Hine and myself, and so we kind of became a team for those first two albums. And I'd been working with Rupert, Hine for a couple of years, and we developed a lot of our own techniques in terms of how we like to record in an experimental way. And so we sort of drew Howard into, he was he was experimenting with being a solo electronic keyboard player. We brought in some of our sort of unusual recording techniques. And we spent a lot of time in the studio together experimenting. And so those first two albums have got some actually quite radical stuff on them, as well as them just being great sort of electronic 80s pop. There's some really interesting things. Now, after those two, Howard went off and worked with other producers and carried on doing some very important frontline stuff. But during his sort of the intervening years, I've worked with him on so many different occasions. On some of his albums, I've worked in his private studio doing some work. I also got involved with him on various levels, creating visuals. And that came about because in about 2006, 2007, Howard was wanting to put out like an EP, well, not an EP, it was actually a DVD of surround sound remixes of 4 songs. And he wanted to put these out a bit like an EP because it's only 4 songs on a DVD. And when he asked me to do one of the songs, it was a remix of something he'd recorded with something else. And when I was creating this, I said, really, Howard, when you create the DVD for this, I think it'd be quite nice to have something to look at the same time, not just a title screen, something experimental to look at. Because back then, it wasn't doing visuals with remixes and things like that. Well, hadn't become a particularly prominent thing. But I suggested that we do that, and I ended up doing the visuals for all the songs. Now, they were just using all kinds of things that were available at the time, just to create patterns or things that responded to the sound and all the rest. That led to Howard inviting me to create visuals for all his songs for when he went on the road in, I think it was 2009 or 2010, he went out to tour those 2 original first albums, all the songs. And I created visuals for projection. And so suddenly I was, because I often, the way I hear music, I kind of see it, or I see sound. So I created this for the whole show, and that sort of started the thing off between me and Howard, where I've done more visuals for his live shows, and but I've had other involvement with mixing for him, and it's just a long relationship that's gone on, and but they are reissuing. I've been doing some remixing of his early stuff, which might be coming out next year or something. So more on that anon.
Yeah, good. And well, that's interesting. As you were being the recorder, the mixer, but you were doing visual. Any artist that call you or say, "Man, I know the visual that you did for Howard Jones. Would you?"
No, I haven't
you
really.
do something for me, and
Yeah, I haven't really done that with anyone else.
Yeah,
I've done it for myself. I mean,
for yourself. Yeah, I know. Of course, yeah.
Because
We'll talk about that.
that's where it sort of encouraged me with my own material to sort of write both the music and the visual side of it simultaneously. I mean, that's probably a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But that's what kept me really interested in the whole music and sound world over the years, is always having new things to try out and experiment and stretch myself. Getting involved in live shows or live performance or visuals, it sort of kept me going, and getting into surround mixing and all of that. So that's why I'm still sort of kind of enthusiastic and enjoy what I do, because I'm always trying to find a new thing to get into.
Yeah. Wow, that's pretty good, man. You're man, the people that how we doing on time, Steven?
Well, okay, my end, but we're been going quite a long time already, haven't we?
We can do. It's up to you. I could continue, and then we can break it into the next time we speak. I mean, you got so much to talk. You should write a book, man. Keep on telling.
I should write a book. I mean, is there one more thing perhaps we could talk about today that you might want to ask about?
Yeah, definitely. And then we can do a session on, of course, Kate Bush. For Kate Bush, we'll probably talk 2 hours.
I probably can't. That's the only thing. There's so little I can say, but we'll come back to that.
In general terms. Yeah, in general terms. In general terms. I don't want you to go in trouble or,
No.
Kate Bush's lawyers are going after me because you say something and I record it. No, I don't.
That's right. Yeah.
I have enough trouble in my life. I don't. In 1990, you travel around the world with the BBC production One World, One Voice. And of course, that was directed by Kevin Godley, who we interview as well. He's a very nice guy too. You filmed over 400 musicians on location. Feel free to elaborate what was all about.
Well, this was a real once in a lifetime thing to get involved with, and it's a bit of a shame in a sense that it's never been sort of really capitalized and reissued or anything. But I think part of the problem is that so many people involved and so many have to agree about everything, and so I won't go into that side of it. But that was extraordinary because Rupert and I were working on a production for a band. And we were in the middle of working on it in Rupert's house. Rupert had a house he was developing in London, and we were starting on recording some tracks. And Rupert suddenly gave me a phone call one day and said, "Listen, I've just been invited, or we've been invited to get involved in a rather big project. Now, the only thing is that we have to go to a meeting, but are you up for it? Because it means we have to drop the project we're doing, and we'll probably have to start traveling like in a week's time." I go, "Oh my goodness." So, all right. So we found ourselves in a meeting. He'd been asked, I don't know, I can't remember what the connection was that brought Rupert into it, but Kevin had wanted to make originally a 20-minute film for the BBC to end this 2-week period of TV shows that were being shown around the world on various different broadcasting stations called One World. And it was One World Week. It was a week of global broadcasting of drama, documentaries, all kinds of different things, interviews, chat shows, and all the rest. And they wanted to, originally, they approached Kevin Godley to possibly do something like a Live Aid concert. And Kevin had said, well, that's been done. Wouldn't it be much more interesting if we could, do this like a musical chain letter, is what he described it as, where, we travel around different places and we start with one musician and then we add another one and then they take over. And the original idea was to create a bit of music 20 minutes long and film it all. So that, everything you heard was filmed. Anyway, I remember going to a meeting with a room full of production people, and I had no idea. I had no idea what was happening here. I was being asked to, if you like, sort of come on board to do a lot of the recording or supervising the recording, or we had no idea. this was make it up as you go along. We had no idea really what was going to happen. Anyway, there was a week of panic after everybody agreed to get involved. We knew there was a broadcast date in about 3 or 4 months' time ahead, so we had to commit to making this thing ready for then. The idea was to invite all kinds of musicians to take part. So we spent a week trying to get visas, trying to get all our injections and things, because, to travel to some countries, you needed to have all the necessary jabs and
vaccines. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
All of that. And so we had to get that. We had to get visas, short-term visas. So you had the production team sort of organizing this all, but it meant lots of traveling around. I had to research some portable recording equipment. No idea. I went to look at all kinds of systems. Like there was something called Sound Tools that was just being developed, which used a PC computer to record and edit digitally. That company became Pro Tools, which is now a really big thing, but it was just starting. But that was too complicated. There was another company that made a digital recording thing that maybe that would be a good idea. It was all too complex. So for some reason, I can't remember who I discussed it with. I went to talk to companies. I wound up being given a budget to buy a set of microphones, a set of recording devices, a small mixer, some loudspeakers, flight cases to put them all in, cables, headphones, just anything that would allow us to record in different situations. So, okay, a week later, we the production team, which was on the road, was 11 people. I mean, it wasn't that many. It was Rupert, Hine and myself. Kevin Godley is the director of the film side. Then you had a couple of production assistants. You had a couple of film sound guys, and and the camera operator, and also a video guy filming a documentary at the same time. We found ourselves in New York, where Rupert had prepared the opening bit of music with Sting and some electronic musicians from New York, and they created a groove and a simple opening song, and that was it. Went into the studio to record that, and some guest musicians came in and played overdubs. Some rappers came in and did some rap. And so after first day, we had like a load of content. And after a couple of days, that's when I remember Rupert saying with Kevin Godley, look, 20 minutes, that's not going to be enough time to do what we want to do. Let's aim for an hour. And let's get all kinds of things. And so that started the journey. We came back to England. We came to Real World. Now, it's the first time I ever came here in 1990, where Peter contributed some of his time, and there are some world musicians here at the same time. So Peter gave some background effects, and they did some improvised music on the spot and overdubbed. And then we went off to Howard Jones's place, where he did some piano, and a percussionist came in. We went off to David Gilmour's boat, where he has a studio, and recorded him. And now these were all fairly controlled in studio spaces, but then we started to go off and record in places like hotel rooms, or on the street, or on the beach, or and that's where I was having to start using this equipment to play bits of what we'd recorded before, so that people could add to it. Chain letter. It was adding to, layering, all these different things. I could go on about this for hours, but basically we did that for 10 weeks. We traveled around the world, and including going to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, but Leningrad as it was in Russia, to record the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra, a 100-piece orchestra, again with a couple of microphones and a couple of tape machines. And then we came back and spent 4 weeks trying to make sense of all these recordings while Kevin Godley was trying to make sense of all the film. And so we were bouncing backwards and forwards trying to make this program. And so it's an extraordinary, I mean, it could have ended up a real mess, a real shambles, because it was made up as we went along. But it wound up being the most beautiful, continuous, almost hour of music. And it was all basically about the state of the environment and the state of the planet that people used as their inspiration for writing the music and the songs and the lyrics and everything. And it's extraordinary. And I have to say, it's one of the most challenging and exciting projects I've ever done. I just wish it had a bit more sort of public notoriety, but it really is truly a special moment. I mean, it almost killed all of us. It was such hard work. You know, we were on the road. We weren't sleeping on aeroplanes. We were working, you know, making notes, and I was making rough mixes on cassette to hand to the next artist the next day. It was extraordinary. But yeah, that was, and there were so many great artists involved in that. I'm sure you know. You just have to Google it to see the list of people on it. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. How many hours? We're talking. They were at the end, right?
The music?
The whole thing. Yeah. All the filming and all the music. Hundreds of hours, right? But
we had hundreds of hours. We had hundreds of hours recording, but we had lots of alternatives. So we had to make choices about what we would pick, because, you know, we'd have a Peter Gabriel reel of tape that had a layer of drone on it that would then have improvisation for 20 minutes. Well, then we'd have to go in and choose like some really great bits and then layer them with something else and find. So there were hours and hours and hours. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many hours of actual music there were. Yeah, I have a collection of 100 DAT tapes, the digital audio tapes, which have all kinds of stages of bits and pieces, reference mixes en route to getting there. But we had to sort of narrow it down to this 1 hour of compressing all the best moments. And that was the same with the film. They must have had so many reels of film. So when it was broadcast to 26 countries on the same date, live, back in the days when, you know, it's before streaming and before the internet. So it was shown simultaneously in 26 countries to, it's like 250 million people. Some people say it was more than that, but it was a lot of people watching it at the same time. But it was also, there was a documentary made about the making of it, and they showed it by showing the documentary first, showing you the journey, and then showing you the result, which was a very clever way of doing it, rather than showing you the art and then explaining it. It was taking you on the journey that led to it. And so it's as a 2-hour special, it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, wow! I need to Google and do more research on it, because it's fascinating. I hope, you know, we keep on screwing the environment. You know, that was done in 1990, and now 30 years after that, still we are
nothing's changed.
The same problem. Nothing's changed.
So yeah.
Would make a difference.
It's a real shame.
Yeah,
there was supposed to be a 30-year edition reissue of it, of One World, One Voice, but it hit some problems in during lockdown, basically manufacturing and getting agreements and everything. So that's kind of gone on hold, unfortunately. But we'll see.
Yeah, we need to convince Peter Gabriel and then ping Kevin Godley again to do part 2 and yourself. Rupert is not with us anymore, but
No,
it'd be good to do a sort of version 2, 30 years review and the same mess.
well, it would be the fact is that all the stuff I had to take on the road with me then, I could do most of it on my phone now. Do you know what I mean? It's like I had
Yeah.
I had 10 flight cases of equipment with me. If I had my phone and a microphone, I could probably, and a pair of earbuds, I could probably do it all even quicker.
Yeah, I know, it's cheaper too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with me again.
Yeah, let's leave it there for now. Yeah.
And then we'll do part 3 and part 4. Hopefully, hey, if we end up doing a lot of things, part 2, 3, 4, they can, take look at this, the transcript, and write a book itself.
There you go.
Oh, I remember
Yes.
the interview with Claudio. I can use them to write my own, my own book or something. But it's very nice talking to you again.
Okay, and to you. Okay, thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you, man. Take it easy.
Okay.
Bye.